Good evening, and welcome to the second event in MUSE Winston-Salem's community read of Beyond Innocence, The Life Sentence of Daryl Hunt by Phoebe Zerwick. 2 weeks ago, we kicked off this series with a stimulating and poignant panel discussion featuring Mark Rabel and the Reverends John Mendez and Rob Stevens, all three of whom knew Daryl Hunt well. Together, they reflected on Phoebe Zerwick's book, Daryl Hunt's Legacy, and the traumatic impact that Daryl's painful journey of injustice and eventual death had on those who fought for him and loved him. Daryl Hunt's story will remain central to tonight's event. Indeed, one of tonight's panelists is yet another one of Daryl's friends, colleagues, and advocates featured in the book. But following the lead of the author, Phoebe Zerwick, whose book offers a portrait of, quote, the toll of the carceral state on one man, end quote, not just to illuminate that individual story, but to stir, in Phoebe's words, a larger, quote, reckoning with the failures of our justice system, end quote. Tonight, we will open our view up to matters of the carceral South. Our panelists arrive here tonight from an interesting and divergent set of angles. One, an academic historian of the American South and its system of mass incarceration. One from the world of legal advocacy and criminal justice policy reform in North Carolina. And another from the West Coast, an actor who will soon travel to Winston-Salem with an important story aimed, like Phoebe's book, at prodding our community and state toward that reckoning that still promises to be one of Daryl Hunt's gifts to us all. My name is Mike Wakeford. I'm Executive Director of MUSE Winston-Salem, and tonight it's my honor to welcome all of you in the audience to this event and serve as moderator for what I know will be a fascinating discussion. Before we begin, I just want to make a few announcements. First, I want to give a big round of thanks to our organizational partners without whom this community read wouldn't be possible. I want to tonight especially thank the Wake Forest University Department of History for making this evening possible. Additionally, however, I want to give special thanks to the Wake Forest University Humanities Institute that is supporting this community read with the help of a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Also want to thank the Forsyth County Public Library, which, as you know, will play host on Sunday the 24th at 4 p.m. to an author talk with Phoebe Zerwick. Aperture Cinema, which, as you know, is hosting the screening of the trials of Daryl Hunt next Tuesday evening. More on that in a moment. Bookmarks, our local independent bookseller that is so great in partnering with us and helping us distribute books to many of you. So thanks to all of those great partners. I do also want to just echo a couple things that you have probably received an email or two from me about in the last couple of days. First, the special screening of the trials of Daryl Hunt, which is next Tuesday night at 6:30 p.m. at Aperture Cinema, is sold out. We want to make sure that that is a full house, though, and so in the emails that I've sent you, there are two things. One, if you reserve tickets and suddenly realize as the date draws closer that you're not going to be able to use those seats, Aperture would be more than happy to hear from you. And you can tell them that to put your tickets back into the inventory, and we will redistribute those tickets to folks who are on the wait list. So if you didn't get there in time to reserve tickets the first time around, if you go to the Google form that we are going to post in the chat bar and that you can find in that email and put yourself on the wait list, as tickets become available, we'll reach out to you and make sure that every seat that evening is filled with interested audience members. So look forward to seeing lots of you there on Tuesday evening. Also want to just remind you about another additional opportunity that we promoted starting about a week ago. We realized that these panel discussions, as interesting and stimulating as they are, don't necessarily satisfy a desire to hold the book in your hands and sit with other community members and just talk about the book in more of a traditional book club style discussion. And so with that in mind, we recently by email sent around to registered participants a forum that you can sign up for one of two small group discussions, one in person and one in person at the Central Library downtown, and another on Zoom. It's been great to see folks signing up for that. We'll send out reminders to those who are registered, but also look for that form. And we would love to have as many of you as are interested come together and just talk about the book in an informal way, starting next Wednesday, which is the first of those sessions, or the following Tuesday, which is the second of those sessions. And finally, last but not least, I do want to just mention that once now and then again toward the end of our program, we're going to share a link in the chat bar that will give you an exciting opportunity to support MUSE Winston-Salem and its ability to continuing offering programs like this one, and I should mention, to complete our planned renovation and reopening of the museum itself at 226 South Liberty Street in downtown Winston-Salem, right on the strollway just between Salem Parkway and the Willows Bistro Depot building. We are excited about that, and we depend on your support. We're an independent 501c3 and depend on public support to do what we do. So if you're enjoying this community read, please let us know with a gift, and just ahead of time, thank you for your generosity. And then I'm almost done talking, just a couple program notes about the evening ahead. We will hold audience questions and discussion until the latter part of the program. But if as questions come up and comments come up, don't hesitate. You don't have to sit on them and try to remember them. Just open up the chat bar, type them in there, and my colleague Alana and I will be watching those closely, and we will curate them and use them to moderate a Q&A toward the end of the evening. The first, the next 45 minutes or so will be given over to our panel, and then when the time is right, we will move to Q&A. So we'd love to see your questions and comments starting to stack up in the chat bar, and we will take care of them for you. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I will turn things over to them. So first, Dr. T Dion Bailey is an assistant professor of history at Colgate University, whose interdisciplinary work focuses on the mass incarceration of Black girls and women in the American South. Bailey earned a PhD in history at the University of Mississippi and is currently working on a book project, Daughters of Jim Crow's Injustice: African-American Women, Mass Incarceration, and the Business of Black Women's Bodies, 1890 to 1980. In 2021, Bailey co-edited a special issue of the journal Southern Cultures, which comes out of UNC Press. The title of that special issue is The Abolitionist South. She's also the founder of IVOW, a nonprofit organization that aids incarcerated women in their transition out of the penal system. Welcome, Dr. Bailey. Tarrah Callahan is the founder and executive director of Conservatives for Criminal Justice Reform and co-founder of Conservatives for Criminal Justice Initiative. Tarrah serves on the Juvenile Justice Advisory Committee, the Governor's Task Force for Race and Criminal Justice, the North Carolina Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, and works with the SBI's Center for the Reduction of Law Enforcement Use of Force. Prior to founding CCJR, she was involved in nonprofit advocacy in North Carolina for over 10 years. And Tarrah, should quickly mention, is the aforementioned panelist who is a personal friend, was a personal friend and colleague of Daryl Hunt's, and I'm sure that will and is featured in the book, and I'm sure that relationship will be further commented upon later in the program. Finally, John Neblett is an actor, and acting is something for which he first discovered a passion through his participation in Shakespeare at San Quentin during his own incarceration there. John holds a BA in drama from San Francisco State University and is a member of the Returned Citizens Theater Troupe. Currently, Neblett is a cast member of The Box, a national touring show that explores the inhumanity of solitary confinement and is slated, the Box is slated to visit Winston-Salem, I'm happy to say, in late August 2022. It will be, its run will be at the Ramcat. Those tickets are not available yet, but soon will be, and we're going to do our best to make sure all of you know about it when we know more details. But we're really excited about that, and we're excited to meet John and hear about this show. And so welcome to all three panelists. And with that, I'm going to step out of the way and hand things over for a short presentation by Dr. Bailey.
Thank you, Mike. Good evening, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure and honor to be here with everyone tonight for our community read of Beyond Innocence, the life and sentence of Daryl Hunt by Phoebe Zerwick. And tonight, right, for me, this sort of is full circle. It brings me really home to have a chance to sit down and really kind of dive into not only my own work, but right, my life's work that is also very personal to me. So first, before I get started, I want to send out a lot of thank yous. Phoebe, thank you for this book. It has really informed me in my own work and in the work that I do around social justice. So I definitely want to say thank you. Mike, thank you for the invitation, the sponsors of the event, and then also my two co-panelists, Tarrah and John. So it's just an complete honor for me to be here. So I have a little presentation. For me, it's just kind of contextualize mass incarceration in the South. So I'm going to share my screen with everyone. Let me get this here. And so tonight I would like to share a few thoughts with everyone that really draws from my academic work and, as I said, my life's work. This work not only seeks avenues toward abolition and practices of true liberation, but this work is also work that seeks justice in the carceral South. And so for me, abolition is a real life-saving practice and one that also fights to push for and work toward racial and gender justice in the carceral state. And so what I hope to leave you all here with tonight is a clear picture of why it is imperative that when we as a collective are seeking justice in the carceral state, and in an effort to, as I hope, build a better world and future together, that we also include the names and stories of Black girls and women who, for me, as I understand it, right, have continued to find themselves incarcerated in a penal system that historically has sought to criminalize and demonize their very existence. So as a scholar and social justice activist whose work mainly focuses on the mass incarceration of Black girls and women in the South, the story of Daryl Hunt is a story that, even though the genders are different, the story itself is one that is all too familiar. And so this photo that you see here are the nameless Black girls and women who I speak for, as this work is not my own. I'm seeking justice for these women and countless others who the South, and more specifically the Southern penal system, has criminalized and whose history, frankly, never intended to be sort of primary historical actors or figures. And it is these Black girls and women who are often nameless and forgotten faces of the Southern penal system that has really focused on the narratives and stories of Black boys and men. And so for me, to have a full picture, right, we have to consider all, because this system is brutal for everyone. It's brutal for Black boys and men, Black girls and women, families, right, communities, and just everyone in general. So as as I think about, right, the story of over policing and systematic racism, mass incarceration is one that the Black community has experienced since, most of us know, right, since the end of the Civil War with the passage of the 13th Amendment, which we know abolished slavery, right, but also paved the way for the incarceration of Black bodies with these few words, right, except for the punishment of a crime. And as you can tell in the photo that you are looking at, the South was intent on debasing, criminalizing, and punishing African Americans who ultimately had no form of recourse or avenues to justice. So this system then was set up to be inhumane, cruel, and violent. And therefore, the stories are always brutal, as we can tell by the story of Daryl. However, we must also understand that we see this story all the time, so much so that many are often desensitized when a news story recounts encounters that involves African American men and women, boys and girls, young and elder. So for me then, in thinking about the countless stories that we see, including when young Black youth have encounters with truancy officers in school, for example, or where teachers get physical, especially with young Black girls who are, as I quote, acting out, right? Or police encounters with young Black girls and boys that turn deadly. And the narrative is that the young girl is bad, dangerous, or unruly, and that the young Black boy was a criminal, a thug, or in historical terms, a Black brute. The system enacts its own form of justice where the trial and jury are the very people who deem African Americans' very existence criminal, dangerous, and worthy of control. And it is here where these narratives wrought in racism led to such horrific stories, including Daryl Hunt's, which we are discussing here tonight. I do want to say that these narratives, right, we know that they rarely focus on the real issues that affect Black communities, including, but not limited to, um, the lack of resources, including education, healthcare, income, home stability, and physical or mental abuse. Abuse, and that's just to name a few. So, as a historian, I'm charged with keeping a distance from many subjects so as to not develop biases. Daryl Hunt's story, however, brought up so much, I guess, rage and hurt when I began to think about how a Southern penal system, steeped in the history of racial and gender biases, and one that is so bent on enacting illegal forms of what it considers justice through any means, use racist, unjust, and coercive tactics as a way of punishing individuals, even especially Daryl, and individuals, right, who often have no access to or to stage a proper legal defense. The system seemingly is set up to railroad Black and brown bodies to ensure their criminalization and incarceration. So this brings me to several stories, just a few that take on the same overtone as Daryl Hunt's story. However, we do see a little differences, right? Particularly in gender. But we see that young Black girls and women are at the center. First is the tragic story of who you see here, Miss Little Hetty. I call her Little Miss Hetty Record. Her story, a story that I always say this, I never intend to take ownership or pat myself on the back for uncovering her story, but it is a story of about injustice at its highest level. I found Record as I was conducting research for my dissertation, and it was just by happenstance. And so one of the things I want you to see and kind of point a picture is even how, right, this is a 9-year-old little girl, and I'll talk a little bit about her, but just look how the newspapers are already demonizing and criminalizing her. So as you can see, the 1896 newspaper article is clearly wrought in racism, as the cover story read, "Convict number 262, Hetty Record, the 9-year-old murderess." And this short but intriguing tale of Hetty record, it is related to the Mississippi injustice system, as I call it, at the end of the 19th century, is only one but small, poignant story that reveals the importance of Black girls and women's bodies during imprisonment and in freedom. So the state of Mississippi convicted 9-year-old Hetty Record of murder, and essentially, right, what she was tried by a white jury. She was ultimately found guilty of manslaughter. So Mississippi, they say that they enacted a form of leniency. But she is sentenced to 10 years in the state penitentiary and it specifically says hard labor. And so this means that Record became the youngest person in the state of Mississippi by 2 years to ever be confined and charged of murder or manslaughter, as most children previously had been sent to the state penitentiary for manslaughter, but then had been released. So even when considering, Record's questionable testimony, at 9 years old, we see that a system was intent on condemning her, using her own words to criminalize her and seal her fate. And so what is sort of clear to me is that Mississippi, steeped in historical racism, definitely wanted to make sure that even at the tender age of 9, that Hetty Record was punished and she's treated as an adult. And so she's incarcerated, and she actually spends the entire 10 years incarcerated. And so what for me then sort of is this historical arc is we see that by the late 19th and early 20th century, in using mechanisms formed around criminalization and imprisonment, white men across the South could and did enact in various forms, particularly through exploitation and punishment, and they never faced any social or political ramifications. So whether through segregation, lynching, incarceration, white Southerners sought ways to protect white supremacy, used under a guise, right, of protecting, right, white womanhood of the South. And these are some of the themes that reverberate for me in Daryl's story. This also meant that being Black in the South predestined thousands and thousands of people to a servile state, one that many people viewed as dangerous, criminal, and a people that must be controlled. So it is this story and countless others like this story of Hetty Record that are deeply rooted in race, class, and gender biases that seem to fade away just as quickly and quietly as they enter into the newspapers, news feeds, and other social media accounts. And that is even if they reach us at all. This brutal story, I must be honest, is prevalent in my own family's history. Both my mother and my sister were incarcerated. My mother in the 1970s, before I was born, and she passed away when I was 14. And I didn't find out about her incarceration until I was in graduate school. So, I never got to ask her about her incarceration or what it was like. But it is these stories, right? My sister was incarcerated in 2014, 15. So we've had countless conversations about her incarceration. So this is why the story of Daryl Hunt is very, sort of real to me in a real kind of way. These stories, both known and unknown, is why my life's work is where I center Black girls and women in the context of the Southern penal system. I look to lift the veil, shatter the silences, and uncover intertwined histories of racial and gender equalities in the South that place both Black girls and women and Black boys and women really in the same basket. And so this story is a story the story of Jamie and Gladys Scott is a story that really, for me, also resembled Daryl Hunt's story, if not by the ending, but by how the penal system sought to criminalize Blackness. And so I will leave you really with this story of both Gladys and Jamie Scott. These are sisters. Neither women have been in much trouble with the law. As young Black women growing up and living in rural Mississippi, both women's economic circumstances meant that they had a challenging time reaching social or economic progress. As young mothers, Gladys and Jamie worked hard to earn an honest living and support their children. Gladys, who was 19 years old, was expecting her second child. Her older sister, Jamie, was 22 and had 3 young children herself. Life often seemed difficult for the sisters, but both maintained adequate employment in their own residences. The feeling that this was not enough often worried the sisters, so they worked extra hours at a local factory in the Mississippi Delta to make money while their mother helped with their children. Both women constantly tried to find ways to make ends meet and secure a future for their children. So one event altered their path in life and would mean that they would not have the opportunity to raise their beautiful children. So whether they were victims of circumstance or affiliation, the armed robbery accusations levied against the sisters changed their lives forever. So on the night of December 24th, 1993, Gladys and Jamie Scott met trouble in a little rural town in the Mississippi Delta called Forest, Mississippi, at a mini mart convenience store. This trip to the store the sisters had made numerous times would gravely affect not only their lives, but the lives of their children, their mother, and even their communities. So just a quick version of the story. The sisters met up with 2 men in their neighborhood. They knew from their community, they knew these men. They often would hang out. The men had just gotten paid, so they all go to this local mini mart. And then there's various stories, but they are accused of robbing these 2 gentlemen. And it is here where the state of Mississippi used its racist ideologies of Black women and enacted one of the most brutal miscarriage of justice that we have seen in the South. Gladys and Jamie were arrested and charged with 2 counts of armed robbery, which in the state of Mississippi carried a life sentence for each conviction. The amount of money the sisters were accused of stealing was $11. And even though no one was injured in the alleged robbery, what happened next served as a marker of an unjust judicial system and one that is all too familiar across other Southern states. And so according to their sentences, Gladys and Jamie would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, pending parole after each served a minimum of 20 years. And so it means that Mississippi State Penitentiary, which then branches off and has a Mississippi Correctional Facility for women, would then house these Scott sisters. So this judicial system the Scott sisters encountered demonstrated injustice at the highest level. And for me, this is the same type of system that Daryl Hunt encountered. And we go back to this story, even though the 3 teenagers who had testified against the Scott sisters, they admitted that they had committed the robbery. Actually, they recanted their false testimony that they had given during the Scott sisters' trial. Gladys and Jamie received no leniency from the courts. The young men who had been painted as petty criminals in newspaper accounts and in court records testified before a judge and jury that authorities forced them to implicate the sisters as the masterminds behind the robbery. So I think many of you have read Beyond Innocence, you can kind of see these themes. And for their testimony, the prosecutors offered the 3 young men plea deals where they would plead guilty on the charge of strong arm robbery and receive reduced sentences of 8 years. The gun that was allegedly used in the robbery was never found. The Scott sisters testified that they had no prior knowledge of, nor did not plan or participate in a robbery. Both sisters stressed that it was car trouble and then just hanging out, asking these 2 friends to take them to the store that had led them into this predicament. So all parties were African American. Mississippi, as well as other southern states, including Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, South Carolina, and as we know, North Carolina, have a history of criminalizing Black men and women. Thus, when the case against the Scott sisters went to trial, it was hard to imagine that they would receive a fair trial. While the incident itself was not racial in any way, this is what their lawyers said, the way it was handled was racial. And according to the Mississippi director of the American Civil Liberties Union, the judicial system that the Scott sisters faced implemented a grave miscarriage of justice. And so in the case of the Scott sisters, this injustice would last 16 years until their mother and some other social activists took up the call for their release. So for me, the story was shocking. And today I can honestly say that I'm unsure why. After careful reflection, I realized too that I grew up in communities that were over policed and hyper surveilled and criminalized. I remember walking to the corner store and police stopping me and asking me where I was going. I remember distinctively my grandmothers telling us how to act in front of or in the presence of the law, as they often referred to the police. I also remember that Black girls and women in my community would be here one day and gone the next, with no explanation, no discussions, just silence. And even while writing this talk and thinking about Daryl Hunt's life, I thought about how even today I'm often scared when I pass police, not because I've done anything wrong other than just trying to get where I'm going, but that fear is real, that you can actually be railroaded, right, into this system. And so for me, the question is still, how do we seek justice in the carceral state when the system is set up to criminalize and debase the very people that it is supposed to protect? It is important to understand that the Scott sisters represent a demographic of people, both men and women, in the Southern penal system that are often rendered voiceless due to their criminalization. So for me then, understanding this history of mass incarceration that has affected hundreds of thousands of Black Southerners in the South since the end of the Civil War is vital to this story, Daryl's story, and countless others. And so more specifically, right, my work is situated here at Parchman, this over 30,000 plus acre farmland patterned after Southern plantations that would house both men and women, white and Black, but that had a very unique form of their own brand of justice. So we know that the growth of the penal system led mostly due to the incarceration of Black and brown bodies further illustrates that people of color continually experience a marked set of justice that has continuously aided in their criminalization. And as scholar Michelle Alexander has argued in her amazing work, The New Jim Crow, mass incarceration also developed in a variety of means, including the war on drugs and poverty, and ultimately the criminal justice system serves as a modern day system of racial control. And so for me, these are the stories, along with Daryl Hunt, right? So as I continue to think about his life, I know that as a social justice advocate, he would also want us to consider and think about the countless stories of Black girls and women who have found themselves racialized as innately sinful and criminal. So for instance, we have Sandra Bland, who was arrested July 10, 2015, died while she was incarcerated. And we know that the hashtag Say Her Name sort of reverberated out of this as a crying call. We also have Corian Grains, Atiana Jeffries, Breonna Taylor. And these are just some of the women, right, that we also have to think about this system having grave effects on. And so I leave you here with some women, right, that also I think about as I do this work. There's countless young men and women who mean so much to me just in when I think about social justice and I think about, right, us thinking about the carceral state and challenging it to be better. And so as we continue to use this type of energy in our local communities, at community reads, and whenever and wherever anyone will listen, Even if they ignore you, it's important for us to make sure Daryl's story and stories of the women you see are not in vain. Shattering the silences and lifting the veil is one of the most important in bringing to the table and keeping the conversation going of the lives and lived experiences of African American men and women in the Southern penal system. Thank you.
Thank you, Dionne. That was really, really interesting and informative. And I have a lot of questions myself already, and I'm tempted to just immediately ask our next panelist, Tarrah Callahan, to comment on how her work intersects with the story you've just told. But I'm going to delay. We'll get to that moment. So first, I'm going to welcome Tarrah Callahan into the discussion. And I'll remind you, those of you who have the book and are reading it, or you may already be past this point, but Tarrah Callahan is featured. I just double checked this around pages 220. 226, 227, 228, and I think the first time Phoebe discusses her and her relationship with Daryl, she's described as a fast-talking 28-year-old college grad. So I think that will be the way to introduce Tarrah now. Tarrah, welcome and thank you for being here. I guess I would start just by asking you if you could talk a little bit about how you came into Daryl's orbit, the beginning of your work and friendship with him.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with all of you. Daryl and I worked together. He was on staff part-time with the NAACP Anti-Death Penalty Project during a time we were working on legislation addressed towards, it was the Racial Justice Act. It was legislation that wanted to acknowledge the role that racial bias played in North Carolina's death penalty. A person who is convicted, a Black person convicted of killing a white person is 3.5 times more likely to receive the death penalty in North Carolina. And that was sort of the impetus towards this legislation. And I have a lot of health issues related to a car accident in college. And so when I found out Daryl didn't have health insurance, that became my mission to find a position with me at the coalition where I could offer him health insurance. And so I was finally able to bring him on to our staff, and it was just, I mean, nobody speaks truth to power like Daryl Hunt. Like he was the most, it was just an absolute honor. I mean, he would call me when he left prayer at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we would just talk through the day about all of the things we were trying to do and all of the things we were trying to change. And we probably presented in every county in the state about the things that we were doing. And there's this one moment at the legislature I remember. These two legislators were continually trying to dodge us, and we both knew which two corners around the building that they would be coming down. So we waited for them at either end, and it was amazing because who gets to unleash the power of Daryl Hunt on legislators but me? It was incredible. And we worked very closely, and he was a very, very dear friend for those years. And towards the end, he dropped off, I guess, a bit in terms of just showing up to things like he had before. And his weekly disappearances became longer, and our conversations became more tense. and ultimately the grant with the coalition expired, and I moved on to create Conservatives for Criminal Justice Reform because I sort of recognized that this space didn't exist. And during the first year that I was running CCJR as a volunteer, Daryl and I would talk probably every couple of weeks, which was really different from our previous cadence. And we didn't have much we could talk about. I was very angry with him because he had told us that he had terminal cancer, and we couldn't get him to go to the doctor. And I was angry with him because I couldn't get him to go to the doctor. And so the only thing that I could talk to him about was what we were doing with this crazy nonprofit I wasn't getting paid for, Conservatives for Criminal Justice Reform. And I'd tell him about these meetings that we had, and he would say, "You're doing it, T, you're doing it." And that is quite honestly part of what still drives me to do the work today.
Can you just thank you, Tarrah, and before I bring John in, can you just say a little bit more about the work of CCJR today, and maybe a bit about the sort of the landscape of issues that are the focus of your work?
Absolutely. So I started CCJR because I realized, we all want to be safe. We all want a government that uses our money in a way that is effective. And the criminal justice is the opposite of all that. So it isn't, I don't see that criminal justice reform should be at odds with conservative principles. I think we just have to message them differently. So over the course, I guess we started in 2016, which I realized that we got our IRS determination letter the same month that Daryl was found dead, which is really eerie. But we have, our first effort was raising the juvenile age in North Carolina from 16 to 18, which makes a huge difference for those charged as juveniles. And now we've been really focused on reentry, which I'm sure you've read in Daryl's book, is a lot of what he focused his life after incarceration on was just the tremendous challenge it is to find, just the simplest of things, job. There was a point during Daryl's life when he moved from Winston and he was trying to move to Durham to live closer to work where I was. And he was looking for an apartment, and he was not able to get the apartment because the front desk pulled up a rape and murder charge on his background. So I had to fax a copy of his pardon of innocence from the governor. And because I'm a bit of a jerk, I also faxed a copy of the Trials of Daryl Hunt to her.
Wow. Well, indeed, I think the issue of reentry that you work actively on now is something we can return to in the conversation later. But I'm gonna take this opportunity to bring John Neblett into the discussion. And John, before I come to you, I'm gonna do a screen share. So just a bit and show a short 5-minute video. So just a little context for the audience. In my introduction, you heard me mention that John Neblett is joining us this evening from the West Coast, and he's an actor based in the Bay Area. And soon enough, though, John Neblett is going to be one of a number of folks who will be wandering the country over the next few months and into the future, but hopefully for a long time as the tour grows. But the End of Isolation tour, as it's known, is going to stop through Winston-Salem for I believe a 3-day performance run at the Ramcat in late August. And there'll be end of isolation tours bringing a play called The Box to the Ramcat. And I'm gonna I think no further context is needed. I'm gonna do a screen share and play a video which will give you a sense of the origins and import of this really remarkable project. Okay.
Hi, I'm Sarah Shord. About 12 years ago, I came home from being held as a political hostage by the Iranian government. I was held for 410 days in solitary confinement. After my release, I was surrounded by people who cared about me, but it was still hard for me to know how to heal. I already knew that our prisons were full of poor and traumatized people, that mass incarceration was driven by systemic racism. But I was still shocked to learn that the extreme isolation I experienced in Iran was being used on such a massive scale in my own country.
Sarah started to write prisoners, and one of these people was Rafael Cacique. Rafael had been in solitary confinement in California's Pelican Bay prison for 13 years when he joined the California Prisoner Hunger Strike in 2013, which was the largest prisoner hunger strike in U.S. history, and an event that inspired Sarah's play, The Box. My name is Carlos Aguirre, and I've had the honor of playing a role inspired by Sarah's correspondence with Rafa in 4 successful productions. In this way, The Box has contributed to a movement in California that led to thousands of people being released from solitary, including Rafa, and to ending the use of isolation against incarcerated youth.
In modern society, isolation is something that hurts everyone, especially during a pandemic. But no one, and I mean no one, can understand the extreme isolation of prison like people who have experienced it themselves. My name is Anthony Michael Jefferson, and I've spent many years of my life in prison and many months in the hole. Acting in this play alongside other formerly incarcerated actors has helped heal me and has changed my life.
Last year, we worked with the Pulitzer Center on a Zoom production of The Box. Then, during the pandemic, we were able to test drive a socially distanced, scalable, immersive production in San Rafael. This was perhaps one of the most challenging moments in U.S. history to do theater, but we managed to keep everyone safe and to sell out all 9 performances.
We'll be taking this new pandemic-inspired iteration on the road for the End of Isolation tour. We'll perform in outdoor venues where our audiences will be masked and socially distanced. Our community partners are the lifeblood of this tour. That's why we're partnering with Unlock the Box, a national organization working to end solitary confinement, to select the most strategic cities where our legislative art can help drive local campaigns to the finish line.
I'm John Comstock. I'm a lawyer, former circuit judge in Northwest Arkansas. I first saw The Box in 2016 in San Francisco. Ever since then, I've been working with Sarah to try to bring it to our community. I was so moved by it, and I really believe it's the kind of art that people need to see so that they can better understand really the brutality that's taking place right in our own area, and to imagine something better. I'm working with the Carceral of Arkansas and others to try to bring the tour to our community, and we believe, I certainly believe, that it will infuse our community with an energy that will help us work to abolish solitary in our state.
We have until June 2022 to raise $100,000. This will feed our crew of 9, provide salaries for our formerly incarcerated cast, pay for an occasional hot meal and hotel after a string of intense performances, and allow us to make a 5-part documentary to share with you at the end of our adventure.
Please, give what you can. Help us knit together these communities, bringing new energies to their efforts and new strength to our movement, to the horrors of mass incarceration with true safety through collective care, transformative justice, and hope.
Thank you.
So really excited about the fact that this is coming our way this summer. And again, I think MUSE is, we've sort of just begun discussions, but I expect that we're going to serve as a community partner for the End of Isolation tour. And so we'll be in good position to keep you all apprised of all the information about it as it becomes available. I think I just note quickly that you heard that I think one of the reasons that it's coming to Winston-Salem, we're very fortunate that I believe that the current executive director or president of the Pulitzer Center, a fellow named John Sawyer, is Winston-Salem native. And so I know the Pulitzer Center has been instrumental in helping initiate that tour. And I have a feeling that hometown connections have helped secure our city as one of its destinations. So, John, this looks just fascinating. I'd invite you to share a bit about your story, and would love for you to share with the audience a bit about how you became an actor, and then how you got involved with this work of art.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. I'm John Neblett. I'm an actor with the Box, and the story could be as long as the story of Odysseus. But what really matters is that I was guilty of the crime I committed. I took another man's life in 1984, confessed and pleaded guilty, was offered a plea agreement, and then I spent 30 years of my life in prison, and the state did not honor its end of the plea agreement. During that time, though, I decided to make a choice to live because I did feel deeply about taking another man's life, and it still hurts to have been that person. But in finding my personal redemption comes from the love of humanity and a love of Shakespeare. In 2006, 2004, I'm in the San Quentin Library and I'm reading the St. Crispin's Day speech. I have a book cracked open, and then a week later, I'm working with Marin Shakespeare because it just moved me so deeply. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And it's not just the condition of men, it's the condition of mankind, including women. It's just that we're going to have to come up with new vocabularies, like my friends in the transgender movement here in San Francisco, teaching everybody pronouns. So for me, my intersection with Daryl Hunt's story, a co-actor of mine, Mr. Julian Glenn Paget, cannot get hair evidence in his case DNA tested to exonerate him. And he has maintained his innocence for over 25 years here in California. Whereas Daryl Hunt was able to get people involved. Julian Glenn, we call him Luke, he's still suffering behind bars. Still working with Marin Shakespeare, though, but can't get the state to get a DNA test on hair in his case. So for me, the Box was, Sarah Shord was dropped my name by Leslie Currier, a retired director of Marin Shakespeare. And she said, I can do this part. I can be depended on. And Sarah, because of her work with incarcerated individuals and, of course, returned citizens, is what we are when we come back to the streets. She offered me this part. And I recently wrote about some of my participation in the Box in a show that we're doing on Marin Shakespeare Returned Citizens Theater Troupe. I don't directly reference the Box, but I do reference my experience. And I'll say Sarah's writing is very informed from her personal experience and from the interviews she did in researching her several books on the subject of solitary confinement. It's not just the play, but the play is the thing we're bringing across the country. And the thing is as Daryl Hunt experienced behind bars, he was there on the front lines with brothers experiencing the trauma of mass incarceration. And that's what it is. If you haven't experienced it, it's a bit more distant. It's kind of like the frontline soldiers in World War I and the generals 20 miles behind the lines in the French chateaus. Okay, that's what people who have not experienced incarceration, the way they tend to think. They are not informed. But when you experience this theater, as you saw in the video, you are there. You are immersed. You're within touching distance. And in the tradition of theater, of course, you have to suspend some disbelief, of course, and listen to the stories. And just as Odysseus gets to speak about his history in his story when he is rescued by a daughter of one of the kings whose beach he lands on. And he tells the story of losing all his people. And the king is touched by Odysseus' story. So this is the court we're bringing. We're bringing this to court, so to speak, where the people are the king. We're bringing our evidence that is based 100% on reality. And of course, you know, I do give the props to corrections professionals who act and live a professional lifestyle. And at work, they are professional, and at home, they are professional. But then there is that 1% that can spoil it for everybody else. And of course, our system protects that 1%, because that's what matters to the system. We're seeking to overturn this paradigm with abolition. And the paradigm starts with, you know, the power of the king to hurt everybody in the name of keeping the peace. Mm-hmm. That's why they think they are so fiercely right in protecting their system, because it does protect us from the war against all. It does do that, but it's not the end all and be all of civilization. That's what theater is about. We're a big part of civilization, just as all our other institutions are. And we're not seeking to overturn civilization, we're seeking to improve it. That's what social justice is about, is giving us a better civilization. It's not about communism. You know, they want to throw that label on everything. No, you know, we're not about a violent revolution. We're about a revolution of the hearts and minds.
So, John, let me intervene for a moment. Yeah. We're coming to 8 o'clock now, and so we'll want to pivot to hearing from the audience with questions in a moment. So please go ahead, and wherever your curiosity takes you, feel free to post some questions in the chat bar, and I'll be watching for them. But on that point, maybe we could open this back up. So it strikes me, and I think Tarrah confirmed my memory of it in conversation the other day, that I was sort of, I confess, I was thinking how to connect this act of social justice oriented art that's coming to this city to the Daryl Hunt story for the purpose of this panel. And I thought I remembered, and Tarrah seemed to confirm that. And if we're both wrong, Phoebe's on the Zoom, so can correct me with a stern shake of her head. That Daryl did spend time in solitary during his incarceration, but I think in Phoebe's book she emphasizes that as often as not, Daryl sought out solitary as a mode of self-protection, which sort of puts horrors of solitary in a slightly different light, or maybe I'm wrong, but nonetheless, I was wondering if I could turn to the other panelists, to Tarrah and Dionne, about how the issue of solitary confinement is relevant and a part of in Tarrah's case, the advocacy work you do in North Carolina, and in Dionne's case, as you've studied and become an expert in the carceral experience of Black girls and women in the South. Does the practice of solitary confinement intersect with that story in any important ways? I'd love to hear from either of you. Whoever talks first gets it.
So I'm talking first because I hope that Professor Bailey will come in with far more eloquent response. I think that he spent what a year total in solitary, 4 years total during his time, and the fact that for Daryl, solitary was a safe space is such a painful juxtaposition of racism and the reality of being a Black man accused of rape and murder of a white woman in the 80s in North Carolina in the South, that a person would feel safer sitting by himself 24 hours a day, when we know from every mental health institute that is completely unhealthy, that he knew that his life was at danger if he wasn't in solitary, is, I think, painful. Because as John stated when we had our preliminary panel, who would seek out solitary as a safety space? Daryl did. Okay, Dionne, go.
And thank you, Tarrah, and thank you, John. Like, yeah, for me, I mean, one of the things that I found in my research and just in my everyday work, you know, working with incarcerated or formerly incarcerated girls and women, is that, you know, that isolation is the worst thing that they would ever want. I know my sister, when she was incarcerated, she was put in isolation at the very beginning, and also on her way out when they were waiting for me to pick her up. And also we could look at the story of Sandra Bland, right? She was just in a jail cell. I mean, she was this little jail in Texas. She was in a jail cell, and then they put her all the way around the corner in the back of the jail. And then, of course, you know, we know sort of those narratives that have come out about Sandra Bland, right? That she hung herself in her cell. And this idea, you know, when we're thinking about mental health, and even Sandra Bland's family says, one, why would they put her all the way around there as this form of punishment when everyone else was in another location? But it just speaks to that type of, you know, hyper punishment, over punishment in a system where even the sheriff was saying that's not their job. That wasn't their particular job. It was just that jail is just to hold people until they can get to court. So, you know, when I think about sort of these systems, it is, as Tarrah said, it's very disheartening. And when I was reading Daryl's story, to think, right, that a person would want to or feel they were safest there in that type of confinement is very brutal.
Thanks. John, just to circle back to you quickly, you shared with us in a pre-conversation that you actually didn't have experience of solitary. But so I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about, given that, what the experience of acting in this play is, and you know how I'm sure you have plenty of stories and experiences with friends who did spend time in that, and could you reflect a bit on how you saw solitary impacting others?
Certainly. For my experience of having men transferred from solitary back to the main line, right? They would, depending on how that circumstance arose, it's all part of a hierarchy of punishments. In California, you have a level 1 prison, 2, 3, 4, 5, in terms of degrees of security. And then you have solitary confinement, right? So each degree of confinement brings you further and further away from society until finally you are alone because they have deemed you too dangerous to be amongst other inmates for the most part. For men seeking safety, it is a matter of perhaps safety from the authorities because you have a very volatile case and authorities might be putting a contract on you, or they might put a contract on you by spreading disinformation about you, okay? Because you've been filing cases against prison authorities, they're gonna label you a child molester, and that's the place where you can go to hide, is in solitary. You can hide from, other people who have been hired to murder you. I mean, these things are not paranoid fantasies. They have happened. So that's where it's at. And so one of my best friends here in reentry, out of 40 years in prison, he spent 20 years in solitary. I cannot teach him to get online to sign up for the San Francisco housing porthole for low-income housing because he is just so traumatized. He doesn't have the attention span to sit down at a computer with me for 2 hours and learn how to sign up for these housing opportunities, which the bureaucracy makes hard for poor people because you have to sign up for every available opening every time you get an email alert. And so the housing situation is screwed that way for people who have to re-enter society. My friend is condemned to a life of being a janitor, and he's living in a tiny home in another person's backyard. Why? Because he cannot be taught. I just can't get him to sit down with me at a computer and teach him what I know about signing up for housing. It's wow. Fantastically sad, but that is the damage. It's physical. They can't make the brain connections.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So we have our first really good question from the audience, and please keep them coming. Otherwise, you're going to hear more from me. So an audience member asks this, almost read my mind, because each of you, at least I think each of you has used the word abolition or abolitionism in the course of this event already. And so this person writes, thank you all for sharing your time, experience, and stories. I'd be interested to hear each of the panelists' definitions of abolition in contemporary terms. Also, how would you encourage us to get involved in the community if we were part of that, if we're interested in abolitionism? Love to hear what's, because it was a question I have too, because obviously the word abolition to historians and most of us probably takes us back into the 19th century, but the term is everywhere today. Dionne, would you mind sharing a thought about that?
Yes, thank you for that question. I mean, for me, as I often say, that abolition is really a life-saving practice for me. It sort of stems from me paying homage and sort of, trying to, in remembrance of my mother, right, who was incarcerated, even my sister, who was incarcerated, but just even in my community. And abolition in many ways means freedom. I think, I could sit here all day and kind of go through different levels of abolition, but it definitely is seeking a system where we're not, sort of looking at a justice system that we know is rooted in injustice, that we're not looking to that system as sort of this kind of pinnacle of enacting justice, right? And so it means a lot of different things to me, but It means saving the lives of those who don't have a platform, who don't have a voice, right? Like, I made it out of my neighborhood. This is really how I feel. And so I have to seek freedom for others, right? Men and women, girls and boys who the system constantly erases, it constantly mistreats, debates. It uses these kind of racist ideologies and tactics to over criminalize and over police certain communities. And then trying to think about abolition and what that means in terms of justice. What does really justice mean? We have a lot of people who are currently incarcerated for things that right now, people are doing for recreation, right? Like, there's a lot of people who are incarcerated under sort of marijuana charges, and now legalizing of marijuana is happening all across the country. So abolition is a very real practice to me. And I think that we all have to do it together, right? I don't put myself at the center, but that means joining in and helping others, lifting others' voices, helping where I can, donating, and even protesting if that's what it takes.
Great. Tarrah, Tarrah, that the abolition as a term of art today.
So the term abolition, frankly, to me is difficult because all of my career has been really focused on strategically finding the ways in which we bring people to the table, and abolition, whether it is abolition of the death penalty or abolition of prisons, is a non-starter for folks on the right. And I think this really resonates with me for a point that was clear in Phoebe's book, and that Dionne and I shared in our panel discussion or pre-panel discussion, was this constant pull that Daryl felt, that I feel, but having not been Daryl, it was much harder for him, of this strategic recognition of what we had to do politically to move the ball, and this constant pull from where he came from, and his need and want to be true to where he came from, but yet also be able to move the ball incrementally forward, because that's how politics work.
I just put a link in the chat that just to pick up on the last part of the question about ways to get involved. Others may have other good suggestions. Locally, I'm most familiar with the Triad Abolition Project that really rallied around the John Neville case starting, I guess, a couple of years ago now, and continues to do a lot of work locally on this. That's one partial answer to that question. I know Mark Rabel, we are fortunate that Mark Rabel is on the Zoom this evening, and I know he has a comment or a question to make. So Mark, I think you're able to unmute yourself now.
Hey, yeah, thank you for this conversation. This is great. Yeah, my question is this. In the United States, there is a presumption of this phrase we've heard, if you do the crime, you do the time. There's basically in the United States a presumption that if you cross the line, you're going to go to prison, right? And we're like the only damn country in the world that has that presumption. I mean, I don't know. There's some countries that don't publicize their incarceration rates, but we are the most incarcerated country in the Western world. How do we change that? Because there's great programs for rehabilitation, homecoming, or reentry, or whatever you want to call it, ways to bring people back into society, ways to not, for example, criminalize the behaviors of people, that in a discriminatory fashion. But, I guess I'm maybe belying what my beliefs are. I mean, I'm not a total abolitionist, because I have represented people that probably, need to be incarcerated, at least for a while, if not a long time. I've done a lot of murder cases. So, I mean, I know how people can be. So I'm not a total abolitionist, but I do believe that we waste a lot of money on incarceration, anywhere from $30,000 to $80,000 a year per person. So, how do we bring people together? And I guess I'm asking Tarrah, I'm asking each of the panelists, what is it that we do to come together on this so we stop wasting money, save lives, and be productive? But thanks for letting me say that.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here, Mark. Anyone on the panel?
I think that we have to, and that is really what the crux of CCJR is about. Using the data that we have, the evidence that we have following 30 years of tough on crime policies, and determining from that what works, and stop using our guts to dictate policy. And the reality is that decarceration does not serve as a deterrent. Throwing people in for long ass sentences does not keep anybody safer. And we've got to shift the way that people look at incarceration. I can't tell you, in my own movement, trying to get people to quit referring to inmates and talking about them as people, we have this entire society set upon this reality wherein they were us versus them. They are the people that commit crimes, and we are the upstanding citizens, and we have to stop that. And I'm going to go to Dr. Bailey because she's nodding.
Yeah, I was totally agreeing with you. And I think that we have a prison industrial complex in this country where we just believe that prison, as Tarrah said, is the end all and be all. And I think that until we come out from under that umbrella, it was a strategic move in the early 80s to kind of create this environment. And it's an environment that continues to thrive. There's private prisons. So when we talk about privatization of prisons, people are making billions of dollars. Probably this, when college campuses when all these companies are invested in prisons, and using incarcerated labor is making desks and tables and all these clothes, tags in Mississippi. Those that are incarcerated are making tags for cars in the state of Mississippi. They're making, different instruments that the state of Mississippi relies on. And so I think until we can get out of this idea that also prisons are considered big business, and like Mississippi, just for instance, parchment is a business for the state. They make millions and millions of dollars for the state. And so until we get out of this prison industrial complex and thinking about prisons and imagining a world, I'm not sure if it's without or how we imagine that, but we have to get out of that mind frame. For me, that's what I think.
John.
My answer to Mark's question, and also perhaps a definition of abolition, is definitely to enforce remove that clause of the 13th Amendment and decouple the prison industrial complex from corrections, from rehabilitation, decouple it, remove those economic incentives, abolish that. Abolish that, because it is the prison industrial complex. Decouple it from public safety. Public safety is paramount. Base it on science. We got vaccinated because of science saying this can save your life. And only just over half of America have been vaccinated. That's the hurdle. That's the hurdle. That other 45%, reaching them and saying this is science-based. I've read so much really good stuff. I want to quote Ralph. I want to mention Ralph Surin. He was a Canadian researcher, and he emphasizes dynamic risk factors for judging a person's violence potential versus static risk factors. Static means something that happened years ago. Dynamic, something that happened yesterday. So when you base your reform of our system on science and dynamic risk factors versus static risk factors that say no change is going to happen, no change is possible. This murderer is a murderer, period. Let's kill him. That's where we're at when we admit that there is no change possible, when that label stays with the person. That's, I want to say Philip Zimbardo wrote a great essay on the fundamental attribution theory, fundamental attribution theory, that I would recommend you read if you haven't read it yet. This is also one of the main architects of the Stanford prison experiment, Philip Zimbardo. This is also one of the people who testified in front of the United States Senate on Abu Ghraib, Philip Zimbardo. All right, so this is where I'm coming from. I'm informed on that side. I know about dynamic risk factors. They were not used in my case. It was the static risk factor that kept me in prison for 30 years until I could completely give themselves the story that nothing else is going to happen in my life anywhere close than the worst 10 seconds of my life.
Yeah. Can we're coming up on the end of the conversation, but I did want to circle back to the issue of reentry, which I think all three of our panelists have talked about today. And could each of you, Dionne, I in particular, I was hoping you might take this opportunity to share a little bit about the organization you founded, which I know has reentry at its core. But then maybe we can hear from Tarrah and John on this too, the big issues in big reform ideas regarding reentry and just the challenges of reentry.
Thank you. Yes, so just quickly, the nonprofit organization is called I Vow, and it seeks to help Black girls and women re-enter society after being incarcerated in the South. And more specifically, we've been working a lot in Mississippi. And so we do a lot with, I just put the link in, you see Southerners on New Ground. And so we do a lot of work where we try to help, help bail, like offer bail assistance. We call it, it's a national day of free Black mamas and with the National Bail Organization, bailout organization. But we also do things like we've started a sort of program with the University of Mississippi where we offer, and not just, right, I know a lot about, like offering courses and all these things, but we're actually talking a real fundamental, being able to earn a degree at the University of Mississippi, being able to offering laptops and being able to take courses online to then earn a degree at the university that then will help, potentially secure positions around the state of Mississippi. And so we also do things like partnering with organizations for housing, food, healthcare. And so that's sort of what the organization does, because as you all know, that reentry is one of the sort of the issues that a lot of people have. For instance, I know someone that was working with someone who was working to re-enter, had fully gainful employment, and then after they were employed for over a week, background check says that they were a convicted felon, and then the police came onto this person's job and removed them. So that is one of the, like trying to not, working with organizations where we ban the box. So those are the kind of the things that the organization does, and is hoping to just continue to do this work so that we can remove some of these barriers that are affecting the formerly incarcerated.
Thank you. Tarrah, I know reentry is on CCRJ's issue list. What's your perspective on what would you have our audience know about reentry and the need for reform or support for reentry?
So 2 years ago, we were able to pass the North Carolina Second Chance Act, which dramatically expanded eligibility for expunctions. When I worked with Daryl, he and Mark Rabel and I had an expunction clinic through the Innocence clinic that Mark directs, and we were so saddened by the number of people we had to turn away that we had coordinated with documentary filmmakers to just come in and serve next to Daryl, as he had to continually turn people down so that they could at least document what they were experiencing. So we had that to share. So in my work, there are moments that I hear Daryl and I feel like I am doing my part to keep his legacy alive. And I think the passage of the North Carolina Second Chance Act was something that took a step forward. But we are fighting. There's no automation. There's no discussion about any sort of expunction of any sort of violent offenses, and any sort of automation, which is paramount to the effectiveness of expunctions. Because let's be frank, how many people really have the money and time to go through the process of petition? So the automation is absolutely essential. So I think that if the audience wants to contact the General, feels compelled to contact the General Assembly about anything, I think it's just that, we want to give our sisters and brothers a chance. A criminal record shouldn't be a death sentence, and that's what it is. It's an economic death sentence.
Yeah, John.
I hope it's my last word on it. One of the things that enlightened me as to the theory of social death was reading the story of Incidents of a Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. And the thing was it woke me up to the concept of social death. So even before reading this book, though, I thought about my own reintegration with society, would maybe the smoothest path to a life I could live would be through the arts or academia. Those are the pathways I chose. And Daryl had a partial pathway into academia. But many of us who do have those records, we still suffer from that fact of the conviction being the cause of our social death. Just as being a young Black woman as a slave was her social death until she did move heaven and earth to escape. The girl lived in an attic through 3 years before she actually set foot to leave the darn plantation. That is the most amazing story I've ever read of human endurance. She may as well have been in solitary confinement. So really, that's the way it is. If a person's left to fight tooth and nail, it's a horrible tale of suffering.
Yeah. And
that person is isolated, like Daryl felt isolated in the end. Couldn't tell the truth to anybody, and he just died in his own world of hurt. And it can be a world of hurt, running your head into the wall of rejection. Rejection, I could be turned down on a date when I'm 14 years old. But then when, I get turned down at jobs delivering cannabis because I have a record, it's pretty laughable. I mean, there are certain mechanisms to ensure that, that doesn't happen, that kind of discrimination doesn't happen. And those mechanisms, they need tuning.
Yeah.
And,
so,
yeah.
Oh, no, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. So it's 8:30, and I want to fulfill our promise to let folks get on with their evening. But I want to just make a couple of announcements, and then I want to give each of our panelists an opportunity if they wish to offer any, if there's something that they thought to say but didn't have a chance, or just have a closing reflection on this conversation. Want to give you a room to do that. I know we have a couple other questions and comments out from the audience. Apologies for not getting to those this evening. Couple announcements. We have 2 more awesome events coming. The screening of The Trials of Daryl Hunt on Tuesday night at Aperture at 6:30. While it's sold out, it isn't impossible that others might still get seats. So if you want a seat, put yourself on that wait list, and we'll do our very best. So that's on Tuesday night, and then Sunday, a week from Sunday, at Central Library, will be the author talk or interview with Phoebe Zerwick. I do want to once again just remind you of how appreciative MUSE is for any donations that you find reason to send our way. It means a lot to us and allows us to continue doing these kinds of programs that are so meaningful to us, and we hope to you as well. And let's see, I think that's all I need to say right now, other than if you want to just stay absolutely abreast of this series and other programs that we would do in the future. Best way is to keep checking back on our Facebook page, or in your emails from us, and secondly, like our Facebook page is what I should have said. And I think that's all I have to say. So I will thank the audience for being here and ask the panelists now if there's any final thought you'd like to offer. You're good, Dionne, Tarrah?
I'll do a quick one. I think you can see from the book, from Phoebe, from Mark, from Daryl Hunt's life inspired all of us to fight for justice, and I hope that all of you are similarly inspired by the book and by these presentations.
Wonderful. Now, Dionne, it looks like maybe you have something now. Now you're holding the book up. Awesome. John, we are looking forward to welcoming you to Winston-Salem in just a few months. But any parting words until we meet again?
Sure. I participated in the National Geographic Genomic Project a couple of years ago. And of course, we're all originally from Africa. And the deal was our tribe, that made it through our pre-extinction event, 120,000 years ago, was not much bigger than this Zoom meeting, if it was that big. And so we're all, we're not all that genetically diverse as a species. I mean, there are other species on this planet that have greater genetic diversity than us, many other species. Okay. So we're very close cousins, every single one of us. And when I am acting on that stage, I am the center of attention of our species, so far as I'm concerned. And it is my, entree into the world and society, and it makes me part of it. And everybody is part of it when they're in that performance. So we share our humanity in the performance. Okay, so.
Well, those are great. That's a great final thought. And
I'm just jumping in. I'm sorry, Mike, to interrupt you. Everybody, just I got a message from Phoebe Zerwick, who's on here. We're lucky to have her on here with us. She just wants to thank all of the panelists and audience. So I'm conveying that message for her. And thank you to you, Phoebe, from all of us.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll see you in just over a week at Central Library. And to all the panelists, thank you so much for being part of this. And to the audience, thanks for sticking with us this evening. And we'll see you down the road. Have a good night.
Night, everybody.
Nighty night.